Tonight, Vladimir Putin. I went to Moscow on the weekend of September 18th for an exclusive interview with the president of Russia. The interview took place at the state residence outside of Moscow. It lasted for an hour and 40 minutes. It was shot by our crews at 60 minutes. The president was conversational, responsive, and expansive.
We support the legitimate government of Syria. And furthermore, it's my deep conviction that any actions to the contrary in order to destroy the legitimate governments will create a situation which you can witness now in the other countries of the region, or in other regions of the world, for instance in Libya, where all the state institutions are disintegrated. We see a similar situation, regrettably, in Iraq. And there is no other solution whatsoever to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the existing legal government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism.
There were no ground rules or requests from President Putin or his staff. They only asked the interview be run on 60 Minutes and then in its entirety on this program. After the interview concluded, President Putin invited me and my 60 Minutes colleagues for tea. Tea turned into appetizers, and appetizers turned into dinner. During the next 90 minutes, we talked of many things about politics and life. Accompanying me on this trip to Moscow were my 60 Minutes colleagues, executive producer Jeff Fager, producer Andy Court, and associate producer Sarah Fitzpatrick. The 60 Minutes interview aired last night on the 48th season premiere of 60 Minutes. Earlier today, both President Obama and President Putin spoke at the United Nations. President Obama was first.
When a dictator slaughters tens of thousands of his own people, that is not just a matter of one nation's internal affairs. It breeds human suffering on an order of magnitude that affects us all. Yes, realism dictates that compromise will be required to end the fighting and ultimately stamp out ISIL. But realism also requires a managed transition away from Assad and to a new leader.
President Obama's speech was followed later by the speech of President Putin.
We think it is an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces who are valiantly fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that no one but President Assad's armed forces and Kurds militia are truly fighting the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in Syria.
This afternoon, the two men met at the United Nations to talk about their differences and their common purpose.
Russia's expanding military intervention in Syria left President Obama little choice but to sit down with Vladimir Putin for the first time in more than 2 years.
As I mentioned, the interview with President Putin was for 1 hour and 40 minutes, a remarkable amount of time for a conversation with the head of state. Here is part one of the unedited conversation recorded on Sunday afternoon, September 20th, at a building near his residence outside Moscow. Part two will air tomorrow night.
Our conversation with 60 Minutes will be recorded and broadcast on Sunday. The next day, you'll speak to the United Nations in a much anticipated address. The first time you've been there in a number of years. What will you say to the UN, to America, to the world?
Поскольку наше интервью выйдет перед моим выступлением, то, мне кажется, было бы нецелесообразно подробно излагать все, что я собираюсь сказать, но в общих чертах, конечно, я вспомню и об истории Организации Объединенных Наций. И уже сейчас могу сказать о том, что решение о создании ООН было принято как раз в нашей стране на Ялтинской конференции.
As our interview will be broadcast before my address, I believe it's not wise to speak about everything that I'm going to say, but I'll give you the general outline. I'll recall the history of the United Nations, and what I can say is that the decision to create this organization was made here in our country, in fact, at the Yalta Conference. The decision was made in the Soviet Union. Russia, the Soviet Union, and Russia, as the legal successor of the USSR, is one of the founding nations of the United Nations and a permanent Security Council member. Sure, I'll have to say a few words about how the current situation and about how international relations are shaping up today. The United Nations remains the only universal international organization which is charged with maintaining international peace and security. And in that sense, there's absolutely no alternative to it. Clearly, it has to adapt to a changing world, and we've all been constantly debating how it should change, at what pace, and what should be changed exactly. And of course, I'll have to, not just that I'll have to, but I'll definitely avail myself of the opportunity to speak from this international rostrum to give the Russian vision of the future of this organization and the international community.
There is much anticipation that you will speak about the threat of ISIS and that your presence in Syria is related to that. What is the purpose of the presence in Syria, and how does that relate to the challenge of ISIS?
Я думаю, просто не сомневаюсь, что о проблеме борьбы
I believe, I'm pretty certain that virtually everyone speaking from the United Nations platform is going to talk about the fight, about the need to fight terrorism. And I can't avoid this issue either. Regarding our, as you put it, presence in Syria, as of today, it's taken the form of supplying weapons to the Syrian government, training personnel, and providing humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. Today, terrorism is a threat for many states in the world. A large number of people suffer from their criminal activities. Hundreds and thousands, millions of people suffer from terrorism. And we're all tasked with joining efforts in order to overcome this common evil. In regards to our, as you said, presence in Syria, today it's expressed in the form of supplying weapons to the Syrian government, training of the personnel, rendering humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people.
В оказании гуманитарной помощи сирийскому народу. Мы исходим из Устава Организации Объединенных Наций.
We proceed from the UN Charter, which means from the fundamental principles of international law, under which any assistance, including military, can and should be rendered exclusively to a legitimate government of a country with their consent or at their request, or upon the decision of the UN Security Council. In this case, we are dealing with a request from the Syrian government to render them military and technical assistance, which we're doing within the framework of lawful international contracts.
Secretary of State John Kerry said the United States welcomes your assistance in the battle against ISIS. Others have taken note of the fact that these are fighter planes, anti-aircraft systems, and those are for use against a conventional army, not extremist.
Там есть только одна обычная легитимная армия. Это армия президента Сирии.
There is only one legitimate conventional army, and that is the army of the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And he's facing, according to the interpretation of some of our international partners, the opposition. But in fact, really, in real life, the army of Bashar al-Assad is dealing with terrorist organizations. But in fact, really, in real life, the army of Bashar al-Assad is dealing with terrorist organizations. Surely you know better than I about the hearings which have just taken place in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, where the military, the representatives from the Pentagon, reported to the senators about what had been done by the United States in order to train the combat units of the opposition forces. They at first had the goal to train 5,000 or 6,000 troops, then 12,000. And then it turned out they had prepared and trained all of the troops. But the only number that were fighting were 4 or 5 men. And all the others, with American weapons, defected to ISIS. That's the first point. Secondly, I believe that providing aid to illegitimate organizations is not in line with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. We support only legitimate government organizations.
И в этой связи мы предлагаем
In this regard, we
сотрудничество
propose to coordinate with the countries in the region to
Мы
create
пытаемся
a certain
создать,
coordinated framework.
некую координационную структуру.
I personally informed the presidents of Turkey, the King of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and also informed the United States, and Mr. Kerry, whom you've just mentioned, had a substantive talk with our Foreign Minister Lavrov. And our military people have been in contact, and we would be glad if we could find a common platform for joint action against the terrorists.
Но и военные наши в контакте между собой обсуждают эту тему. Мы будем рады, если мы найдем общую платформу для совместных действий против террористов.
So you would like to join the United States in the fight against ISIS. That's part of why you're there. Others think that while that may be part of your goal, you're trying to save the Assad administration because they've been losing ground and the war has not been going well for them, and you're there to rescue them.
Правильно, так и есть. Мы оказываем, я уже это сказал дважды в ходе нашей беседы, могу повторить в третий раз, мы оказываем поддержку легитимным властям Сирии.
Correct, that's the case. And I've already said it twice during our talk. I'll repeat it for the third time. We support the legitimate government of Syria. And furthermore, it's my deep conviction that any actions to the contrary in order to destroy the legitimate governments will create a situation which you can witness now in the other countries of the region, or in other regions of the world, for instance in Libya, where all the state institutions are disintegrated. We see a similar situation, regrettably, in Iraq. And there is no other solution whatsoever to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the existing legal government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism, but at the same time urging them to engage in positive dialogue with the rational part of the opposition and with conducting political reforms.
As you know, some of the coalition partners want to see President Assad go first before they will support.
Я бы хотел бы им посоветовать или рекомендовать.
I'd like to advise them and recommend to them the following. They should send this wish to the Syrian people and not to Assad. It's only the Syrian people inside the country who are entitled to decide who should govern their country and how, and by what principles. I believe any advice from the outside is inappropriate, harmful, and contrary to international law.
We have talked about that before. Do you think the President Assad, you support him? Do you support what he is doing in Syria and what is happening to those Syrian people, those many millions of refugees and the hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed, many by his own force?
А как вы считаете, правильно ли поступают те, кто поддерживает вооруженную оппозицию?
Well, tell me, do you think those who support an armed opposition, and mainly the terrorist organizations, only in order to oust Assad are acting correctly, without concern about what will happen from the outside after all the government institutions have been totally demolished in that country? We've already been through that. I've already mentioned Libya. Just now, it was quite recently, the United States actively helped to destroy the state institutions, whether they were good or bad. That's a separate issue. But now, they're destroyed, and now the United States has suffered great losses. The death of their ambassador, for instance. You see what it all leads us to. That's why we support the legitimate state structures. But I want to repeat this once again, in the hope that the needed political reforms will be taken and introduced in Syria. You've said repeatedly that Assad is fighting against his own people. But look at those who control 60% of the territory in Syria.
Но вы посмотрите, кто контролирует 60% территории Сирии. Где это
Where is the civilized opposition? 60% of the territory is controlled either by ISIS or by others, such as al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations. They're recognized as terrorist organizations by the United States, by other states, and by the United Nations. It's they and no one else who controls 60% of the Syrian territories.
So what you're worried about is what might happen after Assad. You're worried about anarchy. You look at the threat of ISIS.
Да.
Are they different? Are they unique as a terrorist organization?
Она превратилась в уникальную, потому что она становится глобальной.
Well, yes, it's turned into a unique organization because it has become global. Indeed, they have the aim to build a caliphate from Portugal to Pakistan. They already claim the Islamic sacred places Mecca and Medina. Their activities, their activism stretch far beyond the territory that they control. As for the refugees, the countries of origin of refugees include not only Syria. Who's fleeing Libya? Who's running from the Central African countries, where Islamists also rule now? Who is fleeing Afghanistan, from Iraq? Are these only refugees running from Syria? Or have you decided that refugees are escaping Syria only as a result of those actions that Assad is committing to protect his own state? Why don't you think that these refugees are fleeing atrocities of terrorists, including atrocities committed by ISIL, who are beheading people, who are burning people alive, who are drowning them alive, who are destroying the monuments of world culture? People are escaping from them, above all from them, and of course from combat operations as well, that's clear. But these hostilities would never have taken place if there had been no financial and armed support to these terrorist groups from the outside. I have an impression that someone who wants to take advantage, either ISIS as a whole or some of these divisions of ISIS to oust Assad, and then only later think about how to get rid of ISIS. It's a complicated task, and I believe that it's virtually impossible to carry out.
Как избавиться от ИГИЛ? Это сложная задача, и мне кажется, она практически неисполнима.
Do you fear they'll come to Russia? Is Russia a fear that you have that if this is not stopped now, it could come to Russia, it could come to throughout Europe and even the United States, that you have to step in because no one else is doing what's necessary to lead the charge against ISIS?
Серьезных шагов в борьбе с этой угрозой действительно мало кто делает.
Well, few have really taken serious steps to fight this threat. In fact, no serious or effective steps have been taken. And we've heard of the effectiveness of the actions of our American partners during the report of the Pentagon and the U.S. Senate. It has to be said frankly, this is a very low level of effectiveness. And I'm not trying at all to be sarcastic here. I'm not trying to call someone out or to point fingers. We propose cooperation. We offer to unite our efforts. As to whether we're afraid or not, well, we have nothing to be afraid of.
Нам нечего бояться. Мы в своей стране и контролируем ситуацию.
We're in our own country, and we control the situation in our country. But we've been down a very hard road fighting terrorism, international terrorism, in the North Caucasus. That's the first point. And the second thing is that we know for sure that in the territory of Syria today, there are fighters, at least 2,000 and maybe more than 2,000, from Russia and other ex-Soviet republics. And of course, the threat of their return to Russia is present, so it's better to help Assad get rid of them there than wait for them to get here.
Okay, but you are saying you stepped in because you did not think the job was being done. And you listened to what happened in the U.S. Senate, and you heard the results, and you said, Russia must act, and I, Vladimir Putin, must act.
Мы и так действуем, и действовали всегда по этому направлению.
Well, we do act, and we've always been acting in this direction. We've been cooperating with many countries. We continue this cooperation, including with the United States of America. We constantly send to our colleagues through our mutual intelligence the information that's needed by the intelligence divisions of the U.S., to maintain security for U.S. citizens both in the U.S. and abroad. But I believe that today such a level of coordination is not enough. We need to work more closely together.
But you believe that the way to do it is what? What's the strategy that you are recommending other than simply supporting the Assad regime?
Да, я уже об этом сказал. Мы должны помочь армии Асада.
Well, yes, I've already said this. We need to help Assad's army because, besides his army, no one is fighting ISIS in Syria. I want you and your audience to finally realize that no one except for Assad's army is fighting ISIS and other terrorist groups now in Syria. No one is fighting them in Syria. And these insignificant attacks from the air, including the bombings by the U.S., don't bring any tangible solution to the issue. There must be work on the ground after the bombing. It must be coordinated. We need to understand which attacks and where they must be launched, and who will come after these strikes are made on the territory. In Syria, there is no other force beside the army of Bashar al-Assad.
Are you prepared to put Russian combat troops on the ground in Syria if it's necessary to defeat ISIS?
Россия не будет участвовать ни в каких войсковых операциях на территории Сирии.
Russia will not participate in any troop operations in the territory of Syria or in any other states. Well, at least we don't plan it as of today, but we're considering the intensification of our work both with President Assad and with our partners in other countries.
What does that mean?
It means that our military servicemen will not participate in combat operations directly. They will not fight. We will support the army of Assad.
Airstrikes?
I mean war, combat operations in Syria, the infantry, the motorized troops.
What else is going to be required? Because I come back to the problem that many people look at, and they believe that Assad helps ISIS, that his reprehensible conduct against the Syrian people using barrel bombs and worse is a recruiting tool for ISIS, and that if he was removed, transitioned at some point, it would be better in the fight against ISIS, al-Nusra, and others.
Выражаясь профессиональным языком спецслужб, могу сказать, что такая оценка.
Well, speaking in the professional language of intelligence services, I can tell you that this kind of assessment is clearly an active measure by enemies of Assad. That is anti-Syrian propaganda. There's nothing in common between Assad and ISIL. They have nothing in common. They're fighting each other. And let me repeat, Assad and his army is the only force which is indeed fighting ISIL.
But there were reports early in the year that you were prepared, or you seemed to be pulling back a degree from your support of him, and that what you wanted to see was a negotiated political transition.
Well, we think that issues of political nature in any country, including Syria, must be decided by the Syrian people, first of all. But we're ready to provide assistance to the official authorities in Syria and to the rational opposition so that they can find some common points and agree upon the political future of their country.
Какие-то точки соприкосновения и договорились о политическом будущем своей страны.
That's why we've organized a series of meetings between the representatives of the opposition and the representatives of Assad's government. We participated in the Geneva conference and we're ready to act in this direction in the future, pushing both sides, the official authorities and the opposition, to negotiate through peaceful means.
Here is what the Washington Post said in an editorial today. Into the vacuum of American leadership, has stepped Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has dispatched troops and equipment to Syria in an effort to force the world to accept his solution to the war, which is the creation of a new coalition to fight the Islamic State that includes in the coalition the Assad government. The interesting thing they are saying is that you have moved into a vacuum of American leadership. The Washington Post.
Мы не заполняем вакуум американского лидерства. Мы пытаемся предотвратить создание.
Well, we're not filling the vacuum of American leadership. We're trying to prevent the creation of a vacuum in the government of Syria in general. Because as soon as government agencies are destroyed in a given state or a given country, that's when a power vacuum occurs. And at that moment, it will be instantly filled with terrorists. That was the case in Libya, and that was the case in Iraq. That was the case in some other countries, in Somalia, and this was the case in Afghanistan as well. For us, there's no question of any fight with the American leadership at all.
Well, the vacuum for our leadership. It seems to be, in knowing you, you have said that a strong centralized government is in the DNA of Russia. You know, and you have a huge fear, as you suggest, in anarchy, maybe in Syria and in other places, of no strong government. That's the fear that Vladimir Putin has.
Well, I'm not saying that there's no strong government in the country. I'm saying that if there is no government at all, then there will be anarchy and a vacuum. And this vacuum and anarchy will rapidly transform into terrorism. Well, take Iraq, for example. There was a well-known figure, Saddam Hussein. Whether he was good or bad, you've probably forgotten that. At some stage, the U.S. was cooperating very actively with Saddam when he was fighting Iran. You've helped him with arms, the diplomatic support was accorded, political cover was provided, etc. Then, for some reason, you had a falling out and the U.S. decided to eliminate Saddam. But by eliminating Saddam Hussein, the U.S. eliminated the Iraqi government and thousands of people from the former Ba'ath Party. Thousands of Iraqi servicemen, which were a part of the Sunni elite of the state, were thrown out on the streets. Nobody thought about them. Now they're filling the ranks of ISIL. That's what we're fighting against. We are not against some country showing its leadership somewhere. We're against thoughtless actions that result in such negative situations that are hard to correct.
As you know, a recent visitor to Moscow was the leader of the Quds forces from Iran, Qasem Soleimani, General Soleimani. What role will he play in the Quds forces in Syria? And what did you two decide is necessary?
I've already said that all countries of the region must unite their efforts in the fight against the common threat, against terrorism in general and ISIS in particular. This refers to Iran and Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that relations between these two countries are not at their best. But ISIS poses a threat to both states. This refers to Jordan, Turkey, in spite of the fact that there are some issues there with regard to the Kurds. But the settlement of the situation, as I believe, is of interest for all. Our task is to unite these efforts to fight the common enemy.
Наша задача в том, чтобы объединить эти усилия для борьбы с общим врагом.
Much is being read into this, including this, that this is a new effort for Russia to take a leadership role in the Middle East, and that it represents a new strategy by you. Is it?
Нет, мы уже упомянули, что заставляет нас и оказывать возрастающую поддержку
No, not really.
правительству Асада.
We've already mentioned what makes us provide growing support to Assad's government and think about the prospects of the situation in the region. I've already told you. You've asked me. I've answered you. About more than 2,000 fighters are in the territory of Syria from the former Soviet republics. There's a threat that they'll return to us. So instead of waiting for their return, we should help Assad fight them in the Syrian territory. So this is the most important motivation, which pushes us to provide assistance to Assad. And in general, we want the situation in the region to stabilize, so that there will be no new Somalia cases there, because it's close to our borders. We want to develop normal relations with these countries. We've traditionally had good relations with the Middle Eastern countries, and we hope that this will continue in the future.
But your pride in Russia means that you would like to see Russia play a bigger role in the world, and this is just one example.
Это не является нашей самоцелью. Я горжусь Россией и уверен, подавляющее большинство граждан моей страны.
Well, it's not an end in itself. I'm proud of Russia, that's true, and I believe that the overall majority in my country loves Russia and respects it. And we have something to be proud of. We have Russian culture, Russian history. We have grounds to believe in the future of our country. But we don't have any obsession with being a superpower in the international arena. We're involved in only one thing: defending our fundamental interests.
But you have, but you are in part a major power because of the nuclear weapons you have. You are a force to be reckoned with.
Ну, надеюсь. Я надеюсь, иначе зачем же мы имеем?
Well, I hope so. I definitely hope so. Otherwise, why do we have those weapons at all?
Ядерное оружие и другие виды вооружений — это средства защиты нашего суверенитета.
We've proceeded from the premise that nuclear weapons or other weapons are the means to defend our sovereignty and legitimate interests. It's not the means for aggressive behavior or for implementing some non-existent imperialist ambitions.
When you go to New York for the UN, will you request a meeting with President Obama?
Such meetings are planned beforehand. President Obama, I believe, during such events does not have a second to spare. There are an enormous number of delegations from all over the world.
A second to spare for the President of Russia?
Well, that's his choice. We're always open to any contact on the highest level, at the highest levels of ministries, agencies, intelligence services. But if the president finds a few minutes to meet me, that'll be great. I'll be happy to meet with him. But if due to circumstances he's not able to do that, well, nothing to worry about. We'll have a chance to speak at the Group of 20 meeting.
Oh, come on. Come on. You know, you'd like to sit down with the president and say, look, I have a plan for Syria. Let's work together. Let's see what we can do. Not only let's work together on Syria, let's see what we can do on other things.
Well, you know, the thing is, such serious matters are discussed. The eyes are finally... Well, you know, the thing is, such serious matters are discussed. The I's are finally dotted at the highest level between the presidents. But they're prepared during consultations by ministries, by military agencies, by intelligence services if necessary. It's a lot of work. So if the work is ready to complete, then there's a special point in meeting. But if they're not at the final stage yet, then we can meet with President Obama, talk to each other, shake hands. But I believe I'm ready to engage in this contact always.
Yeah, leadership comes from the top down. And if you're going there to make a big speech, you want the President of the United States to fully be on board as much as he can. I mean, why don't you pick up the phone and call up and say, as you did after our conversation in St. Petersburg. You telephone the president. Telephone the president again and say, let's make sure we spend some time. The issues are too critical, and two of us can do better than one of us.
Да, и я так делал, я звонил президенту Обаме.
Well, you're right. I did call President Obama about these very issues. That's true. And that's the usual practice of our interaction. There's nothing extraordinary. Let me repeat. Any personal meetings are prepared as a rule by our staffs. We're ready, but I'm telling you for the third time now, that does not depend on us. That does not depend on us. If the Americans want a meeting, we'll have a meeting.
Американская сторона хочет этих встреч, мы будем встречаться.
You need no preparation, none, because you deal with these things every day. You need no preparation to see the President of the United States, nor does he. It's diplomatic nicety you're suggesting, and not. But I hear you. You're prepared.
Сколько лет вы работаете журналистом?
How many years have you been working as a journalist?
More years than I want to remember.
It's difficult for me to give you advice as to what you're prepared for or not prepared for. Why do you think you can give me advice in regard to what I'm ready for or not, when it's not my first term as president? But that's not what's most important. What's most important is that Russia, the president of Russia, and all my colleagues are ready to engage in these contacts at the highest level, at the government level, at the level of the ministries. We're ready to go as far as our American colleagues are ready to go.
Кстати говоря, площадка ООН, она для этого
So, and by the way, the UN platform was created to seek compromise, to engage in negotiations. Definitely, if we use this platform, that will be good.
Let me ask you this. What do you think of President Obama? What's your evaluation of him?
I don't think I'm entitled to give any views regarding the President of the United States. That's up to the American people. We have good personal relations. We're quite frank with each other. Our relations are businesslike. I believe that's quite sufficient to comply with our functions.
Do you think his activities in foreign affairs reflect a weakness? A weakness?
Почему же? Совсем так я не считаю. Понимаете, дело вот в чем. Дело в том, что в любой стране, в том
I don't think so at all.
Штатах,
You know, I believe that in any country, and in the United States, I believe more often than in any other country, political factors are used for domestic political battles. In the U.S., the presidential campaign is coming up soon, so they're playing either the Russian card or some other. All sorts of accusations are made against the current head of state and political opponents. There are many lines of attack, including accusations of weakness, incompetence, or something else. I don't think that's the case, and I don't intend to get involved in a domestic American skirmish.
В том числе обвинения в некомпетентности, в слабости, еще в чем-то. Я так не считаю. И ввязываться во внутриполитические американские дрязги не собираюсь.
Okay, but let me ask you this. Do you think he listens to you?
Мне кажется, что мы все друг другу отчасти прислушиваемся.
Well, I think we'll listen to each other in a way, especially when it comes to something that doesn't go counter to our own ideas about what we should and should not do. But anyway, I think we have a dialogue. We hear each other.
You hear each other.
Yes.
Do you think he considers Russia? You said you're not a superpower. He considers Russia an equal and considers you an equal, which is the way you want to be treated.
Так вы его спросите, он же ваш
Well,
президент.
you ask him. He's your president. How could I know what he thinks? Let me repeat. We have a relationship on an equal footing, both in terms of interpersonal relations and our relations as people are equal. We're respectful of each other, at least, and our professional contacts are at a good working level. How can I know what the President of the United States, of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of Japan, or the Chairman of the State Council of China are thinking? We don't look at what we think they do, but I look at their actions.
I know. Yeah, of course, but I mean, you enjoy the work, you enjoy representing Russia, and you've been an intelligence officer. Intelligence officers know how to read other people. That's part of the job, yes? Yes?
It used to be. Now I have a different job, and that's been for quite some
Somebody
time
in
now.
Russia told me there is no such thing as a former KGB man. Once a KGB man, always a KGB man.
Вы знаете,
You know, not a single stage of our lives passes without a trace. No matter what we're involved in, no matter what we do, all this knowledge we acquire, all the experience will always remain with us, and we carry it further and will use it somehow. Well, in this sense, yes, they're right.
A CIA operative once said to me that one of the training you have is you learn the capacity to be liked as well. Because you have to charm people. You have to charm people. You have to, yes, seduce them.
Well, if the CIA told you, then that's the way it is, because they're not bad specialists in this.
Think out loud for me, though. Think out loud, because this is important. How can the United States and Russia cooperate in the interest of a better world? Think out loud.
Мы все время над этим думаем.
We're always thinking about that. One of the areas of our cooperation, which is extremely important today, and for many people, for millions of people on the planet, is our common joining of forces and our common efforts in countering terror. The other phenomena of this kind, combating drug traffic.
Борьба с распространением оружия массового уничтожения, борьба с голодом, борьба за экологию, борьба за сохранение разнообразия мира, борьба за то, чтобы мир более был прогнозируемым, более стабильным. И в конце концов Россия...
Like where?
Where? In all the regions of the world. Now, as to what you yourself said, you mentioned that Russia and the United States are the greatest nuclear powers. That places additional responsibility on our shoulders. We manage to work together along certain lines. We get along, especially when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. We work together, after all, and in general, we have attained quite positive results.
Мы же работали вместе и в целом добились положительного результата.
How did that work? Because the president has often cited you for the assistance that you gave to reaching a final accord. What did you do? What did your negotiators contribute? Your Foreign Secretary Lavrov.
Дело в том, что
Well, as strange as that may seem, the interests of the United States and Russia do sometimes coincide. And in this case, when I just told you that we have a particular responsibility incumbent upon us for the non-proliferation of WMDs in this area, our interests do precisely coincide. That's why, together with the United States, we've been engaged in consistent, intensive work of the resolution of this issue. But Russia was guided not only by those considerations, but also by the fact that Iran is our neighbor. It's our traditional partner. And that's why we wanted the situation around Iran to be normalized. We believe that after normalization and the resolution of this problem, the security situation in the Middle East will strengthen. In that regard, our evaluation of Iran's nuclear program pretty much coincides with America's.
As you know, the Republicans are running for president, and it's a big debate, and they all are against the Iran nuclear deal. What would you tell them?
I've already said that. If you want me to repeat it, I can. I'm confident that the agreements correspond to the interests of international security and strengthens the situation in the region. It puts definite, serious barriers in the way of WMD proliferation because the IAEA will fully and comprehensively monitor the situation. And that normalizes the situation in the Middle East in general because that helps us to construct normal, business-like partners and political relations with all the countries in the region.
You have a popularity rating in Russia that would make every politician in the world envious. Why are you so popular?
There's something that I have in common with every citizen of Russia, the love of our motherland.
Many of us were moved by an emotional moment at the time of the World War II memory because of the sacrifices Russia had made. And you were seen with a picture of your father with tears in your eyes.
Да, моя семья понесла серьезные потери.
Yes, my family suffered severe losses during the Second World War. My relatives in general, that's true. Well, in my father's family, there were 5 brothers, I believe. I think 4 of them died. On my mother's side, the picture was pretty much the same. Russia has suffered great losses. And of course, we can't forget that. And we must not forget that. Not to put blame on somebody, but to prevent anything like this from happening again in the future. We must remember about this, and we pay a great deal of respect to veterans, including U.S. veterans. And they were present at the Victory Day parade in our country on May 9th of this year. We remembered the sacrifices made by all the countries, such as Great Britain and China. We remember this. And I believe that is our common positive memory about the joint fight against Nazism. And this will continue to be a good platform to overcome those difficulties that we're facing today.
Будет хорошей платформой для того, чтобы преодолевать те проблемы, с которыми мы сталкиваемся сегодня.
That's what you want to rekindle. A sense of partnership with America against common enemies.
Ну, не против общих врагов, а в интересах.
Well, not against common enemies, but in each other's interests.
While you're also popular, as you know, and forgive me, but there are many people who are critical of Russia, as you know. They say that it's more autocratic and less democratic. They say that political opponents and journalists have been killed and imprisoned in Russia. They say your power is unchallenged, and they say that power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What do you say to those people who worry about the climate, the atmosphere in Russia?
Не может быть никакой демократии.
Well, there can be no democracy without implementation of the law and compliance with the law. Everyone must observe the laws. This is the most important thing which we must bear in mind. No one must forget that. As for those tragic events, such as the death of people, including journalists,
Мы делаем всё
Unfortunately,
для того,
they
чтобы
do occur in all
виновники были
countries of the
найдены,
world.
изобличены и
But if they
наказаны.
happen
Мы
in
так
our
будем действовать
country,
по всем
we do the
направлениям.
utmost to
Но
find the
самое главное,
criminals
что
and
мы
to
будем
punish them.
и
And
дальше
we'll do
работать
this
над
in all
совершенствованием нашей
directions.
политической системы.
But the most
С тем,
important thing
чтобы люди
is that we
чувствовали,
will
что
continue to
передовой
improve
человек
our
чувствовал,
political system
что он
so that
влияет
people
на
can
жизнь
feel,
государства и
every
общества, что
citizen
он
can
влияет
feel,
на власть,
that they
и
do
чтобы власть
influence
чувствовала
the
ответственность
country
перед теми людьми,
and the
которые
society, so that the authorities would feel
которые
responsible
доверяют,
with regard to those people who
представителям
trust
власти
them
в ходе
during
избирательной
election
кампании.
campaigns.
I mean, as you well know, if you, as a leader of this country, insist that the rule of law be adhered to, if you insist that justice be done, if you, because of your power, then it could go a long way to eliminating that perception.
Ну, можно многое, но не у всех и не все сразу получается.
Well, a lot
Вот
can be
в
done,
Соединенных
but
Штатах сколько
not everyone
демократический
succeeds with
процесс
everything from the very start.
Ну, с самого
So
начала
here, how
создания
long did it
Соединенных
take the democratic
Ну, а что,
process
сейчас
to
вы
develop
считаете,
in the
что всё
United
решено
States?
с точки зрения
Since the
демократии?
very beginning
Если
of the
бы всё было
creation
решено,
of the
то не
United
было бы
States.
проблемы
Do you
Фергюсона,
believe that
правда?
everything is perfect
Не
now
было бы
from the
других
point of view of
проблем подобного
democracy?
рода.
If
Не было бы
everything was
произвола
perfect,
полиции.
there would be
Но
no
вот,
problem like Ferguson, right?
но
There
наша
would be
задача
no other
заключается в том,
problems of a
чтобы
similar nature.
видеть
There
все
would
эти
be no
проблемы
abuse by the
и
police.
вовремя
But our
и
task is to
должным
see
образом на это
all these
реагировать. То же
problems
самое
and to
касается
react
России. У нас тоже
properly
много
in due
проблем.
time. This is the same case in Russia. A lot of problems.
So the people who killed Mr. Nemtsov will be prosecuted to the fullest.
Я сразу об этом сказал.
Yes,
что
I
это
said it right away
позорная
that this is a
страница в
shameful
нашей
page in our
современной
modern
истории.
history,
И
today's
преступники
history,
должны быть
and
найдены,
criminals must be
изобличены,
prosecuted and punished.
наказаны. Может быть, это не сразу делается.
Well, probably
но
this
у нас
cannot
есть
be
другие
done in a
примеры,
second, but we have had other
преступлений
examples of
подобного
crimes
рода.
of this
И в
kind.
конечном итоге,
And finally, in the
несмотря на
end,
то, что
despite the fact that these
расследование длится достаточно
investigations
долго,
continue
но
for quite a long
приходит к
time,
своему логичному
it concluded in a due manner.
You know that I admire Russia and its culture very much, its literature, its music. It is a large country, a big country. And many people, including Stalin, have said Russia needs a strong, authoritative figure. They worship, Stalin said, that kind of figure. Was Stalin right?
Нет. Я не помню, где он это говорил.
No, he was wrong. I don't remember him saying that, so I can't confirm those quotes. Russia, as any other country in the world, needs just principles for state structure, rather than dictators. Russia needs these principles which flexibly respond to these changes inside the country and outside the country. That's what Russia needs.
Изменения мира внутри страны и вовне. Вот что нужно России.
But there is a tradition of strong leadership here. Of all those people, who do you...
Вы знаете, значит, вот смотрите, в большинстве европейских стран
Well, you know, in most European countries, there's parliamentary democracy. Japan has it, many countries have it. But for some reason, the state structure of the U.S. is quite different. It's a quite rigid presidential republic. Each country has its own special features, its own traditions, which are reflected in today and will be reflected in the future. We also have such traditions in Russia, but we're not talking about some strong figure, although of course such a figure is needed in the leadership. But we need to find an explanation about who this strong man is. Is it a dictator, or is it just a leader who acts within his duties by the law and for the sake of the interest of the major part of the population? If he's acting consistently and in a principled way, this is a totally different situation. So I believe that Russia does need such people, the second type I've mentioned.
И принципиально, то это совершенно другое. Вот я считаю, что Россия вот в таких людях второго
A second class. Russia needs that much more than just people with dictator pretensions.
As you know, some have called you a czar.
Ну и что? Меня,
well, what of it? You know, people call me different names.
Does the name fit?
нет. У нас, знаете,
No,
говорят,
it doesn't fit
хоть
me.
горшком называйте,
You know,
только
we have a
в
saying,
печку не ставь.
call me a pot if you want, just don't put me in the oven. It's not important what you're called, whether by your well-wishers, friends, or your political opponents. What's important is what you yourself think about what you must do for the interests of the country, which has entrusted you with such a position, with such a post, as the head of the Russian state.
Такое место, такой пост, как глава российского государства.
Are people in Russia fearful of you?
Думаю, что нет.
I think not.
Part one of my two-part interview with President Putin of Russia. Tomorrow night, part two. Welcome to the program tonight, part two of my conversation with Vladimir Putin.
You know, as I said, sanctions are illegal actions which violate the principles of the world economy, the principles of the WTO, the United Nations, because sanctions can be introduced only by the decision of the UN Security Council, because unilaterally that is a violation of international law.
And an analysis of the Russian president's visit to the United Nations with Stephen Lee Myers, Margaret Brennan, Carol Lee, and Neil Ferguson.
What you're seeing now is what Russia's intervention is and moves in Syria has forced them to do is to bring this under one full umbrella and try to come up with some sort of comprehensive strategy, which is what the president's critics have been calling for him to do for quite some time.
A conversation with Vladimir Putin and an analysis of his visit to the UNGA when we continue.
From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Tonight, part two of our conversation with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. It took place on September 20th in Moscow. We talked of many things. He gave us an opportunity to have an engaging conversation about him and how he sees Russia and Russia's role in the world. He also gave us an opportunity to have a further conversation after the interview when he invited us in for appetizers, which turned into dinner, and that was a further consideration of all the topics we'd been talking about. But now, the conversation followed by an analysis of his visit to the United States.
Are people in Russia fearful of you?
Думаю, что нет.
I think not.
Я исхожу из того, что большинство людей мне доверяет.
I proceed from the fact that most people trust me if they vote for me at the election. And this is the most important thing. It places enormous responsibility on me, colossal. And I'm grateful to people for this trust, but at the same time, I feel this huge burden of responsibility for doing what I do and for the results of my work.
Well, as you know, in America, you're much talked about in America. There's much conversation, more so than any...
Maybe they have nothing else to do in America but to talk about.
No, or maybe they're curious people. Or maybe you're an interesting character. Maybe that's what it is. But they see this, first of all, a strong leader who presents himself in a strong way. They know of a former KGB agent who came back and got into politics in St. Petersburg and became deputy mayor and then came to Moscow. And the interesting thing is they see these images of you bare-chested on a horse, and they say, there is a man who carefully cultivates his image of strength. I'm asking...
Знаете, мне кажется, что...
You know, I'm convinced that a person who occupies my post must provide a positive example to people. And those areas where he can do this, he's obligated to do this.
В тех областях, где он может делать это, он делать это обязан. У нас в 90-е годы, в начале...
In our country, in the 1990s and early 2000s, we had a very severe situation with the social sphere. The social security system was destroyed. A lot of problems emerged that we still, to this day, cannot effectively resolve fully. In the sphere of healthcare, in the development of sports, and I think that a healthy lifestyle is extremely important.
Это чрезвычайно важная вещь.
And it's the foundation of the resolution of many crucial problems, including the health of the nation.
Невозможно с помощью таблеток
It's impossible
решить
to solve the
проблему
healthcare
здоровья
problems of millions of
Нужно, чтобы
people
у людей
only
было-
by using pills.
был навык,
People need to
было
have the habits
пристрастие,
or
была
passion,
мода
or
на
there
здоровый
even
образ
has to
жизни,
be a
занятия
fashion
физкультурой,
of
спортом.
healthy
Поэтому,
lifestyle, of sports.
Я считаю, что правильно, когда не только
So I
я,
believe
но
that
и
this is a
другие
right
мои
thing
коллеги, и
when not
председатели
only
правительства,
I, but
министры,
other colleagues like heads of
депутаты
government,
Государственной Думы,
ministries, and
когда они,
legislators of the
вот как
State
сегодня,
Duma,
допустим,
when, as
принимают
today, for
участие
example, they participate in the two distance marathon
забеге,
races,
там, на двух дистанциях.
when
Когда
they
они
attend soccer
посещают,
matches, when they
футбольные
participate in
матчи,
sports
когда сами
competitions
принимают
themselves.
участие,
So
в,
this is, well,
спортивных
including from,
соревнованиях.
this is where the love of millions of
Отсюда,
people of
отсюда,
sports
в том
comes
числе,
from.
не только, но в том числе, зарождается интерес или любовь миллионов людей к занятиям физической культурой и спорту. Я считаю, что это
I think it's extremely
чрезвычайно
important.
May I suggest, I hear you, and that is important. But may I suggest also you do like the image that you present, bare-chested, on horseback, as a strong leader. That's who you want to be seen as, for your people and for the world.
Я хочу, чтобы...
I want everybody to know that Russia
Россия
as
в
a
целом
whole, and the leadership of Russia in particular, are something effective and properly functioning.
И должным образом функционирующее, что это все вместе и сама страна,
That altogether, Russia, both the country itself and these institutions, its leaders, are healthy people, competent people, who are ready to cooperate with our partners wherever they are, whether in the fields of sports, politics, or cooperation in the fight against these threats.
по борьбе с современными угрозами. Я думаю, что здесь, кроме позитива,
I think that there is
ничего
only
нет.
positive in this.
Well, it's appropriate to believe that you would believe in a strong leader because you believe in a strong central government, and you've suggested what happens when you don't have that. Are you curious about America? More than simply another nation that you have to deal with? Because they're curious about you, as I suggested. Are you curious? Are you watching the Republican political debates?
Ну, наблюдать так, чтобы совсем уже в ежедневном режиме.
Well, I wouldn't say I watch them daily, no, but
No,
of
no,
course we're
конечно,
curious
интересно,
about what's
что
going
происходит
on
в
in the
Соединенных
U.S.
Штатах.
It's a major
Крупнейшая
world
мировая
power,
держава,
an economic and
экономический
military
военный
leader.
лидер сегодня. Это
So,
очевидный
of
факт.
course,
Поэтому,
America exerts great influence on the
Америка
situation in the
оказывает
world in
огромное
general.
влияние на
And of course,
ситуацию в
we're
мире в
interested
целом.
in what's going
Конечно,
on.
не безинтересно, что там происходит. Мы внимательно за этим
And
наблюдаем.
we keep a
так,
close
чтобы в
watch, but
ежедневном режиме
I don't
следить
watch the
за
internal political
перипетиями
saga on an everyday basis.
внутриамериканской жизни. Это
I'd say more
скорее
likely
нет,
no.
чем да.
Yeah. Because if you watch that, I mean, it's Donald Trump says, you know who he is. He said he would like to meet you because he thinks the two of you would get along. That's Donald Trump.
Да, я слышал, да, я слышал. Ну, мы будем рады
Yeah, I heard that. I heard that. Well, we'll be glad to have any contact with the next president of the United States. Any person who gains the trust of the American people can count on the fact that we will work with him.
Будем с ним работать.
Marco Rubio is running for the Republican nomination, and he said some terrible things about you. You know, this is political debate and in a political campaign. I understand. He said that you were like a gangster. He was attacking you because he wanted to have an attacking Russia.
How can I be a gangster if I worked for the KGB? That simply has no basis in reality.
What do you admire most about America?
Творческий подход к решению
I like the creativity.
Открытость.
Creativity when it comes to your tackling problems. Their openness, because it allows them to unleash the inner potential of their people. And thanks to that, America has attained such great results in developing their country.
Потрясающих успехов в развитии в своем развитии.
Russia had Sputnik. You were there before the United States. Russia has extraordinary astrophysicists. Russia has extraordinary leaders in medicine and in science and in physics. I mean, do you hope that what you can do is restore that leadership and create the same kind of innovation that you just admired America for? And how will you do that?
Нам нужно не утратить то, что было создано за предыдущие десятилетия.
We shouldn't lose what was created in the previous decades, and we should create the very conditions for showing the potential of our people, because we're a very talented people. We have a very good basis, which you mentioned. You said that you love Russian culture. I think that's a great basis for internal development. You've just mentioned our achievements in science and many other areas. We must support that. We must create conditions for people to develop freely, for them to feel confident that they're able to realize their potential.
Чувствовали себя в состоянии реализовать свой потенциал, уверен, просто абсолютно убежден в том, что это.
And I'm confident that we will have an effect on the consistent development of science, of high-tech technologies, and of the economy in the country overall.
In America, the Supreme Court, as you know, there's been some controversy here about gay rights. In America, the Supreme Court declared it a constitutional right for same-sex marriage. Do you applaud America and the court for doing that? You think that's a good idea, to make it a constitutional right for same-sex marriage?
Вы знаете, это ведь неоднородная группа людей.
Well, you know, I think that's not a homogeneous group of people. Some representatives of the non-traditional sexual orientation, for example, speak out against the adoption of children by such couples. They themselves are against it. So, do you think these people are less democratic than other representatives of this community, this gay community, who support child adoption by gay couples? Most likely not. But that's simply their take on the issue. The problem of sexual minorities in Russia has been deliberately exaggerated from the outside for political reasons. I believe without any good reason. We don't have any such problem.
Okay, help us understand.
Well, I'll explain it for you. It's well known that in 4 states in America, homosexual orientation is a crime. Whether that's good or bad isn't the issue. We know there's a ruling of the Supreme Court, but this problem has not disappeared. It's not completely removed from American legislation, but we don't have that.
So you would condemn that?
Yes, I condemn that. I believe that there should not be any criminal prosecution or any other prosecution or infringement of people's rights on the basis of their race, ethnicity, religious, or sexual orientation. That should be excluded in the modern world.
Так вот у нас этого и нет. У нас была, если мне память не изменяет, в Уголовном кодексе РСФСР 120-я статья.
If my memory doesn't fail me, we had Article 120 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR, which had prosecutions on the basis of homosexuality. We've abolished all of that. We have no persecution at all. People of non-traditional sexual orientation live in peace. They work, they get promoted, they get state awards for their achievements in science and the arts and other areas. They receive medals. I personally have awarded them medals. But this is what the question was: a ban on propaganda of homosexuality among minors. I don't see anything undemocratic in this legal act. I only proceed from the fact that we should leave children in peace. We should give them a chance to grow, to realize who they are, and to decide for themselves. Who is this person? What does he consider himself to be? A man or a woman? Do they want to live in a normal, natural marriage or a non-traditional one? That's all. I simply don't observe here any infringement of the rights of people of non-traditional sexual orientation. I believe this has been a deliberate exaggeration with the purpose of making a group of people from Russia for the purpose of making an enemy of Russia for political considerations. I believe this is one of the lines of attack against Russia.
По политическим соображениям, как одна из линий атак против России.
From where?
Со стороны тех, кто это делает.
From the side of those who do that. Look and see who does this.
So you're saying that as far as you're concerned, there is as much a recognition for gay rights and gay marriage as there is in the United States. That's your position.
Мы не только признаем.
We do not only recognize, but we ensure their rights. In Russia, equal rights are guaranteed for everyone, including for people of non-traditional sexual orientation.
Ukraine. You and I have talked about Ukraine before. Many believe that as a result of what happened in Ukraine and Crimea, the United States and the West imposed sanctions. And those sanctions have hurt Russia. And that you believe by reemerging and in trying to be a positive force around the world and in Syria, that it might somehow lessen the focus on Ukraine.
Не очень. Чтобы отвлечь внимание от украинской
So do you mean that will help to somehow distract the attention from the Ukrainian crisis?
Yes.
So our actions in Syria are aimed at distracting? Is that what you mean? No. Ukraine is a separate and major issue for us. Syria is a different issue. And I told you why. We don't want the disintegration of Syria. We don't want the return of terrorists and of those who engage in warfare coming back to Russia. So there's a whole complexity of problems. When it comes to Ukraine, that's a separate issue. It's our closest neighbor. We've always said that it's our brother country.
Это не просто славянский народ, это самый близкий к русским народ.
It's not only the Slavs. Our languages are very similar. We have common history, common culture, common religion, and many things in common.
Что я считаю абсолютно неприемлемым.
What I believe is absolutely inadmissible is the resolution of internal political issues in the former USSR republics through color revolutions, through coup d'état, through unconstitutional removal of power.
С помощью переворотов и неконституционным способом смещения власти действующей. Вот это абсолютно неприемлемо.
That is totally unacceptable. Our partners in the United States have supported those who ousted Yanukovych.
You believe that the United States had something to do with the ousting of Yanukovych and he had to flee to Russia.
I know that for sure. I know those people who live in Ukraine. We have thousands of contacts with them. We know where and when, and who met with someone, and who worked with those who ousted Yanukovych, how they were supported, how much they were paid, how they were trained, where, in which countries, and who those instructors were. We know everything. And our American partners don't try to conceal that anyway. They said, yes, well, we did. We did train them. And we spent that much money. And it amounts to $5 billion. So there's no secret about it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're suggesting that this...
Nobody's even arguing against that.
You respect the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Конечно.
Sure, but we want other countries to respect the sovereignty of other countries and Ukraine in particular. Respect for sovereignty means to not allow unconstitutional action and coup d'état, the removal of legitimate power.
How will that...
That is something that should not be...
How will the renewal of legitimate power take place in your judgment? How will that come about? And what role will Russia play?
Россия никогда не принимает и не собирается принимать участие в действиях, направленных на...
Russia has not taken part and is not going to take part in any actions aimed at removing the legitimate government.
То результат очень тяжелый.
What I'm saying is that somebody does that. The result is very difficult to deal with. In Libya, we've seen the disintegration of the state. In Iraq, we've seen the territory's been filled with terrorists. In Syria, the situation is unfolding the same way. In Afghanistan, you very well know what the situation looks like. What happened in Ukraine? The coup d'etat led to a civil war. Many citizens of Ukraine did not have trust in Yanukovych, that's true. But they should have gone to the elections and elected a new leader, not commit the removal of power. But after the coup d'etat, somebody supported that, somebody liked it, but somebody did not. And those who did not like it were treated from the position of force.
Начали разговаривать с позиции силы. Результат — гражданская война.
I repeat, what are you prepared to do?
Сейчас скажу.
Let me tell you, if your question is about that, I believe Russia and other international actors, those who are more actively engaged in the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, I mean Germany and France, the so-called Normandy Four, of course with the active engagement of the United States. And in that direction, we have intensified our dialogue in this sphere. We all should strive for full and unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements must be fulfilled.
Должны стремиться к полному и безусловному исполнению тех договоренностей, которые достигнуты были в Минске. Надо исполнять Минские
But that's exactly what John Kerry said yesterday, coming out of a meeting with the British foreign minister. He mentioned after Syria, Ukraine. And he said, we have to have a full implementation of the Minsk agreements. So you and John Kerry are just like this. You agree. Implement the Minsk agreement.
In full. In full. Could you please have enough patience and not interrupt me for 2 minutes? And I ask you to please present this without cuts. Can you do this? Do you have enough power to do this, to present it without cuts?
Yes.
Исполнение Минских соглашений означает, там несколько пунктов, я скажу о главном.
The implementation of the Minsk agreements means there are several articles, but I'll speak about the main points so that the situation in Ukraine changes fundamentally.
Первое. Нужно принять изменения.
There should be political reform. That's first. There should be constitutional changes. That's what's set forth in the Minsk agreements.
Теперь самое главное.
Then, most important, the Minsk agreements state this should be done in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk.
Это принципиальный вопрос.
And that is a matter of principle. Ukraine, there are reforms introduced in the constitution in the first reading, but there's been no coordination with Luhansk and Donetsk at all, and no one even intends to coordinate anything with them. That's point one. Point two, it's stated in the Minsk agreements that there should be the implementation of the law. The law was already passed in Ukraine of the special self-governance status of those territories. They've adopted this law. Its implementation has been postponed. That means that the Minsk agreements are not fulfilled on this point. And third, there should have been the amnesty law. How can one engage in a dialogue with people from Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk if they're all being prosecuted? They're all being brought legal charges against them. That's why the Minsk agreements say that a law on amnesty must be adopted, but it's not been adopted.
Он не принят. Есть еще ряд пунктов. Вот, например,
and there are other points as well. For example, conducting local elections. It's been written in the Minsk agreements to adopt a law on local elections upon coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine has adopted the law on local elections. The representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk sent their proposals on this law 3 times, but nobody even talked to them. The Minsk agreements say, with coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. That's why I respect and love Mr. Kerry. He's an extremely experienced diplomat, very experienced diplomat. He told me that he was against Star Wars back in the past, and it was the right thing to do. Because maybe if he was the one who adopted decisions on ABM, we probably wouldn't have any conflicts on ABM right now. But if one side says, we've done this, that, and that, we've complied with the Minsk agreements, it's not true. Because all these points must be implemented in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. There has been no coordination so far. As for the implementation of the already adopted law on the special self-governance of these territories, the Minsk agreements say within 30 days. Nothing has been done yet. It's been postponed. The entering into force of this law has been postponed. That's why we advocate the full and unconditional implementation of the Minsk agreements by both sides, not as interpreted by one of the sides, but as it's written down in the Minsk agreements.
You really believe that?
There's nothing to believe, actually. It's written on paper. You just need to read it. It's written in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Read the document for yourself. And I'm telling you, there has been no coordination at all. It was written to adopt the law on the special status within 30 days. But the law has not been enforced. So who's not implementing the Minsk agreements?
You've mentioned the Secretary of State. He also said that it's important not only to implement the Minsk agreement, but also for separatists to give up the idea of independent elections. John Kerry said that yesterday.
Well, yes, I know the position of our U.S. friends, and here's what I want to say in this regard. I just mentioned this. I see I'm forced to repeat it. The Minsk agreements say that a law on local elections must be passed in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. So what happened in reality? The Kiev authorities did adopt the law on their own without any coordination or negotiations with Donetsk and Luhansk, in spite of the fact that Donetsk and Luhansk sent their draft 3 times. There was no dialogue at all. They've adopted this on their own without any consultations. Moreover, the law that was adopted by Kiev says that in these territories there will not be elections at all. How are we to understand this? In fact, they themselves have provoked the representative of Donetsk and Luhansk to schedule their own elections. That's all there is to it.
Okay.
So we're ready together with Mr. Kerry to discuss all of this, but we need to prod both sides to implement what they've put their signatures to, rather than to pass off as something good what they've done on their own initiative.
I hear you, but I wanted to repeat that because Secretary Kerry emphasized separatist elections. I did hear you. Here is what I think.
Well, he's being cunning. As Secretary of State and as a diplomat, he's being cunning. It's quite normal for his profession and for his work. All diplomats are quite cunning. So is he.
You would never do that, would you?
No, I would never do that. I'm not a diplomat.
What are you? How do you see yourself?
I'm a human being. I'm a citizen of the Russian Federation. I'm a Russian.
You also have said that the worst thing that happened last century was the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There are those who look at Ukraine, especially Ukraine and Georgia, and they believe that you do not want to recreate the Soviet Empire, but you do want to recreate a sphere of influence which you think Russia deserves because of the relationship that has existed. Why are you smiling? Why?
You're making me happy because we're always suspected of some ambitions, and they always try to distort something or hint at something. I indeed said that I believe that the collapse of the USSR was a huge tragedy of the 20th century. You know why? Because first of all, in a single instant, 25 million Russian people found themselves beyond the borders of the Russian Federation. Here they had been living within the borders of a unified state, and always traditionally, the Soviet Union had been called Russia, Soviet Russia. Well, this was Greater Russia. Then all of a sudden, the USSR collapsed, just overnight, in fact, right? And it's turned out that in former Soviet republics, there were people, Russian people, numbering 25 million. They had been living in a single country, and all of a sudden, they turned out to be abroad. You can imagine how many problems arose. First of all, there were everyday problems, economic problems, social problems, the separation of families. You can't list them all. Do you think it's normal that 25 million people, Russian people, wound up abroad all of a sudden? Russians turned out to be the largest divided nation in the world today. Is that not a problem? Well, not for you, but it's a problem for me.
And what do you intend to do about it?
What we want to do is use modern civilized processes to preserve, at least at a minimum, the common humanitarian space. To make it so that these state borders do not get in the way, so that people can communicate freely among themselves, so that we can develop our economies jointly. We want to take advantage of those benefits of the former USSR that we've inherited. What are these benefits? Joint infrastructure, a unified railroad system, a unified highway system, a unified energy system, and finally, if I dare say it, the great Russian language which unites all former republics of the Soviet Union, and which gives us evident competitive advantages when promoting various integration projects in the territory of the post-Soviet space. You've probably heard that we first established the Customs Union, and then we've transformed it into the Eurasian Economic Union. So when people can communicate freely and move freely, when workforces, goods, services, and capital move freely, there are no state lines when we have our common rules and legal regulation in the social sphere, for example. Then this is quite enough. People must feel free.
But do you have to use and show military force to accomplish that objective?
No, of course not.
You have a military presence on the border of Ukraine, and some even argue that there have been Russian troops in Ukraine.
Well, you have a military presence in Europe.
Yes.
The tactical nuclear weapons of the United States are in Europe. Let's not forget that. What does that mean? Does it mean that you've occupied Germany, or that you renounced the occupation of Germany after World War II, and then you have only transformed the occupation forces into NATO forces? One could put it that way, but we're not putting it that way. And if we have our military forces on our border, on our territory, on the border with some state, you believe this is a crime?
I didn't say a crime.
Well, in order to run these activities that I've told you about, this economic, humanitarian, and social integration, military force would not be needed at all. We've built our customs union, the Eurasian Economic Union, not with the use of force, but through seeking a compromise. This is a complicated process, a difficult, long-standing process, through negotiations and through the search for a compromise on mutually beneficial and acceptable conditions, with the exception that we would create for our people and for our economies more effective advantages in world markets and in the international arena in general.
So while we're talking about this, tell me about the Baltic states and your intentions towards the Baltic states.
Мы бы хотели строить с ними дружественные.
Well, we'd like to build friendly relations with them. There are a lot of Russian people living there who remained after the Soviet Union. They're violated there. Their rights have been violated.
Их права. Вы знаете, что во многих прибалтийских государствах
You know that in many Baltic states, they have invented some new thing in international law. This has been the case up until now regarding citizenship.
в гражданском, с точки зрения
A citizen, a foreigner, a person without citizenship, and dual nationals, that is, people with dual citizenship.
и человек без гражданства, и бипатриды, то есть люди с двойным гражданством. В прибалтийских республиках
The Baltic states have invented something totally new. You know what they call them? They call them non-citizens.
не гражданами называют.
They call people who have been living for decades in the territory of the Baltic states and who have been deprived of a whole number of political rights. They cannot take part in elections. Their political and social rights are restricted. And everyone keeps silent about this, as if this is the way it's supposed to be. And of course, this cannot help but provoke an appropriate response. But I proceed from the fact that our colleagues both in the US and the European Union will base on today's principles of humanitarian law and will proceed from modern principles of humanitarian law and will ensure the political liberties and rights for all people.
Политические свободы и права всех людей, в том числе и
including for those people who are living in the territory of Baltic states after the collapse of the USSR. But when it comes to economic ties, we have stable, very developed contracts with these countries. You know, but there are some things, how can I put this more delicately, that bother me and make me sad. We're all talking about the need to have a rapprochement, to bring our positions closer, about the need to integrate economically, politically. So, as for the Baltic states, we had a single energy system. So the Baltic states were naturally part of this common power system of the Soviet Union. Now, what are they doing? Everyone's talking about rapprochement, Russia and the European Union. What actually happens in practice now is that they plan to remove the Baltic states from this unified energy system of the former Soviet Union and hook them up to the European system. So what does that mean for us in practice? It means that among some of our regions in the Russian Federation, there will be some zones where there will be no electric power lines. Because before it went through the Baltic countries. And so it means that, once again, spending billions of US dollars, this system must be built from scratch, just as our European partners will have to spend billions of dollars to hook up the Baltic states to their energy grid. Why? Why, when we're striving for some sort of joint work and integration, not in words, but in practice? Why do this? And this is what's happening along many lines. They say one thing, but they do something quite different. I think that this all comes from growing pains, and I believe that common sense will finally prevail, if not here, on other issues. We're all interested in developing openly without any prejudice. The Baltic states above all, and for them, this is more important for them than Russia itself. Take one of the countries, Lithuania, for instance, in the Soviet era. Do you know what the population was? 3.4 million people. And now, I checked the latest references, 1.4 million. Where did the people go?
Down.
In that country, yes. Over half the citizens left the country. Can you imagine what would happen if half the American population left the U.S.? It would be a disaster. What does that tell us? That tells us that the links that were lost, above all in the economy, have a negative impact on us, and on Russia as well. That's why I'm deeply convinced that we should abandon the phobias of the past. We should look ahead and act based on the international law to build good neighborly relations on an equal footing.
And eliminate sanctions.
Well, if someone likes to work so much through using sanctions, go ahead, you can do that, but it's harmful. It goes against international law, as I've mentioned, first of all. And secondly, tell me where the policy of imposing sanctions has been effective. Nowhere, especially with regard to a country like Russia.
Even your friends worry about the Russian economy because of sanctions first, but also declining oil prices. You know, is that a huge challenge for you? Is that a troubling global economic reality?
You know, as I said, sanctions are illegal actions which violate the principles of the world economy, the principles of the WTO, the United Nations, because sanctions can be introduced only by the decision of the UN Security Council, because unilaterally that is a violation of international law. Well, let's leave it aside. Of course sanctions are harmful. But they're not the main reason for the slump in the growth of the Russian economy or other problems related to inflation. The main reason for us really is the drop in prices on the world market for our traditional export commodities, such as oil and gas and some other goods.
Вот это главное. Но санкции, они, конечно, добавляют сюда.
When it comes to sanctions, they add to the negative side. They do have an influence one way or another, although they don't have a capital, fundamental importance for our economy.
You can survive sanctions.
Это само собой, это даже.
Well, that goes without saying, no doubt. It's beyond discussion.
Есть даже определенный плюс.
There's even a certain positive side to it. Do you know what the advantage is? It's many things, especially when it comes to high technologies. We used to prefer to buy them, to use our petrodollars. But now, since these sanctions are imposed, we either can't buy these technologies, or we fear that something may be closed off to us, and now we're forced to introduce entire programs for developing our own high-tech economy in industry, manufacturing, and science. And that's in fact something we would have to do anyway. But it was difficult for us before because our own domestic markets were flooded with foreign goods. So in the WTO, it was difficult to support our local manufacturers. But now that the sanctions have been imposed, our partners have voluntarily left our market. Now we have a chance for development.
Let me have two more questions first.
Of course, you have the floor.
You've been president, prime minister, president. How long do you want to serve? And what do you want to be your legacy? One question.
Это зависит, как долго, зависит от двух обстоятельств.
Well, how long? That depends on two things. First of all, unquestionably, there are regulations provided for by the Constitution, and they'll never be violated by me for certain. But I'm not sure that I should fully exercise all these constitutional rights. That'll depend on the specific situation in the country and the world, well, on my own sentiments about it.
And what do you want your legacy to be?
That Russia should be effective, competitive, should have a sustainable economy, with a developed social and political system that is flexible, both in regard to changes within and around the country.
And should play a major role in the world that it lives.
It should be competitive, as I said, and should be in a position to defend its own interests and to influence those processes which are significant to it.
Many say you're all powerful here in Russia. Many say you're all powerful. And they believe that you can have anything you want. Anything. What do you want? Tell America, tell the world what Vladimir Putin wants.
I want for Russia to be as I've just described it. That's really my main desire. I want people to be happy, and that our partners all over the world would want to and would strive to develop relations with Russia.
Thank you.
That was part two of our conversation with President Putin, which took place in Moscow on September 20th. We now talk about what happened at the United Nations General Assembly. President Obama and President Putin spoke at the UNGA on Monday. They met afterwards in their first formal meeting in 2 years. President Putin called that discussion, quote, surprisingly very frank. Joining us now from Washington, Stephen Lee Myers of the New York Times. He spent 7 years as the newspaper's Moscow correspondent. He is the author of the new book, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. From CBS in New York is CBS News foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. Here in New York, Carol Lee. She is a White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Also in New York, Neil Ferguson, a professor of history at Harvard. I'm pleased to have all of them here. Neil Ferguson's first volume history, memoir or biography it is, of Henry Kissinger has just been published. It is called Henry Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealist. Carol, you've been following the story. Mm-hmm. Exactly what happened?
They saw each other at a lunch. Putin made a grand entrance in the middle of Ban Ki-moon's speech and sat at the table where the president was, and they clinked champagne glasses at the end of the Secretary General's speech, and then they went into a private meeting, which lasted 90 minutes. And, you know, I've covered this president for 6 years, and I've covered other meetings that he's had with Vladimir Putin. And this was the first time that the U.S. officials came out of that meeting and felt like they weren't arguing about the terms of what the problem is. You know, that often happened with Ukraine in particular. They were more arguing about how to approach the problem.
Margaret, what can you add to what we may know from the American side of this meeting between the two leaders?
Well, you know, Putin himself was only in the country for about 7 hours. It was very much, I'm here, I'm making a statement, and I'm leaving. And it's interesting, when you ask U.S. officials and they don't want to answer a question on Russia, their favorite tagline, talking point is always, it's hard to get inside Putin's head. And I think that's really what sums up what this meeting was about. I mean, this meeting with the president and Vladimir Putin went on far longer than many expected. And it really has stalled U.S. policy in many ways up to this point, because people wanted to see what is Putin going to put on the table. And from what I'm hearing, he didn't put much concrete offer on the table, at least not the way that there were expectations raised in terms of hearing his vision for exactly what to do in Syria. He raised a concept, but he didn't give a proposal.
How did you see the way Putin played this?
He played it astonishingly well. Here we find ourselves in a situation that Russia is now apparently the broker of peace in Syria. Now, that's an extraordinary turn of events, and it's a sign of how clever Putin is, that he's able to do this from a position of extreme economic weakness. Yeah. Not only the sanctions, but the oil price collapse have really hit the Russian economy hard, and yet he's come to New York, apparently the power broker, and I find that an amazing achievement, and frankly a rather sad reflection on the nous of our president.
Stephen, what do you think his objectives are here?
A lot of people have looked at this as some sort of game or brinkmanship that Putin has somehow achieved a victory over Obama or what have you. There's no question that he's put Russia into the center of the discussion, but I think it's way too soon to say that he's achieved anything by that. If you look at what they're doing in Syria right now, they're very concerned about the fate of their biggest ally in the region. And they've been involved in Syria from the beginning of this war. And I think that the reason you're seeing the buildup, the military involvement, is a sign of not strength, but fear and weakness, that the Assad government is in danger of falling, and that the reaction has been to build that up.
Talking to people in the administration before I went to see Putin about where they stood, you know, that they have changed. Margaret, help me understand where John Kerry is on the question of Assad, because he's had a long relationship with Assad.
He has. He's been to the country. He's negotiated with Bashar al-Assad directly. And arguably, he is the one who has this assignment of figuring out what to do put on his desk and has been pushed hard to get more done. A lot of what's being done here in New York is what you might call small ball in terms of pushing the Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, to help agree to small-scale ceasefires in Syria through UN auspices, also limiting some of the instruments of death, so to speak, that Assad uses, specifically the barrel bombs that he's dropping on civilians. This is the level of request that they're actually negotiating over right now. They are not at the place of talking Assad out of power. In fact, the United States has been sitting down with the Saudi foreign minister and the Russian foreign minister to talk about who might be in that next transition government. But when they say transition, they're not talking about Assad exiting on day one. In fact, you've heard some say Assad wouldn't exit until ISIS is defeated. And as you know from U.S. officials and military assessments, we are years off possibly from that happening. So there's negotiation over that time frame of when he'd walk out.
I've been an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin. I once compared him to Michael Corleone in a Time magazine article, so I'm no fan. But if this had been a debating contest, Putin would have won it hands down at the UN General Assembly. Because what did President Obama say? He spent part of his speech criticizing Iran, and then part of his speech criticizing Russia, and then he concluded by saying, could they please help him sort out Syria? And even more extraordinarily, he said at one point that we had left a vacuum of power in Libya by getting rid of Gaddafi, though he didn't mention him by name. And then he concluded his speech by saying we needed to get rid of Assad in Syria. I mean, the holes in the arguments are absolutely enormous. Putin's position was a simpler one. We allowed states to disintegrate in North Africa and the Middle East, and this has had desperate consequences, and you can't really argue with him about that.
Just from the standpoint of whether there is working room for these two countries to find some place to attack ISIS. And the other question that's on the table for me is, has the Assad regime had any success in fighting ISIS, and have they been focused on fighting ISIS?
Well, so the White House's hope in terms of whether they can reach some sort of an agreement with Russia on this is that Vladimir Putin is not wedded to Assad the person, but the Assad regime, and in that sense
or a sovereign government.
Right, and in that sense that they can negotiate some kind of agreement where he steps down in several years, most likely. That's increasingly the way that they're explaining it.
And everybody's prepared, they think, to accept that idea that he can be in power as much as 2 or 3 years, as long as we're making progress by getting rid of ISIS.
Well, the hope is that they can spin it in a way or set it up structure it in a way that outlines a plan that sends the message that he is on the way out, or effectively a lame duck. The interesting thing about all of this is that what this Russia's intervention has done is you've had this president deal with the fight against Islamic State and the civil war in Syria, and the White House officials have always described that as parallel tracks. And what you're seeing now is what Russia's intervention and moves in Syria has forced them to do is to bring this under one full umbrella and try to come up with some sort of comprehensive strategy, which is what the president's critics have been calling for him to do for quite some time.
But this comes at the same time the administration is acknowledging huge failure in supporting.
That's the other element, is that they've had huge failures in their approach to the Islamic State, and obviously failures in their approach to handling the civil war. And now he's looking for a way out. And look, every president has a major crisis that hangs over them, and this is Barack Obama's, and he only has a year and change left, and it's unclear whether he can really change the dynamics on the ground there in that short amount of time.
Stephen Lee Myers, I want you to bring this back. Tell us who he is.
Even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were suggestions that he understood the essential corruption of the system, the stagnation of the system. But he wants very much to restore the greatness of the state, at least the Russian state, on the level that he knew growing up as a young man, and that gives him this incredible devotion and loyalty to the state power. It's in his blood from his service in the KGB, his understanding of what makes a country powerful, and especially a country like Russia. is the central security of the state and the strength of the institutions of it. To him, that's much more important than values of democracy or freedom of speech and so forth. And when you look at the experience that Russia went through after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he considers it his great accomplishment that he's been able to restore the stability of the state, turn around the economy, essentially begin a transition to a new Russia. And when he sees what the United States has done, it's essentially, in his mind, having replaced the bipolar world of the Cold War with a unilateral power, the hegemon, the one country. And he talked about that quite strikingly during his remarks in New York, and I think he's trying to say that the world needs to go back to the order that recognizes the great powers like Russia, like China, and not just the single superpower. And so when he looks at the events in Iraq under President Bush and continuing today, the invasion of Afghanistan and what's happening, he sees the Americans throwing their weight around the world, and that has led to chaos because they've essentially not respected Russia's importance in these discussions.
Stephen Lear's book is called The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Thank you very much. Neil Ferguson's new book, Kissinger, 1923-1960, The Idealist. Margaret Brennan, thank you for taking time for us.
Thank you, Charlie. And I will say, one thing this all does, this makes John Kerry's job that much harder to keep any kind of anti-ISIS coalition together. The Arab states are not happy about the U.S. getting any closer or coordinating in any way with Russia.
And Iran, and especially Iran, too.
Exactly.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Carol, thank you. It's
Thank
great
you.
to have you here.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.